Hello everyone and welcome. This episode marks the first in a few episodes that are all going to center around space shuttles, how to build them and how to fly them. We're going to start off as simple as we can before moving on to something like NASA's space shuttle. So today what we're going to be doing is building this relatively simple but functional Mark II space shuttle, capable of deploying smaller payloads in low Kerbin orbit. Next episode is going to be on how to launch and fly this thing before we get on to the bigger kahunas. As always, you can find links to the craft files down there in the description, so let's get started. So our shuttle is going to be built using parts that are tier 6 or lower. We're not going to use any parts above tier 6. Now, tier 6 is the level where you first get the Mark II cockpit and some other Mark II parts. There are some further Mark II parts that come up in the tier after that, as well as you start to get into some of the Mark III parts in this tier as well. We'll use this kind of stuff in a more advanced shuttle in a later episode. And this isn't the first shuttle that I built. I do have another video that you built a lower tiered shuttle using nothing but tier 5 parts and lower, but that shuttle was more limited in its capabilities. This time we're going to build a shuttle that is actually capable of bringing up a payload. So this is our payload, the Eve-001, and if you are a follower of my live streams, a vessel that's exceedingly similar to this one was featured over a few of my live stream episodes as this vessel, or actually one that was actually very similar to it, because this vessel here is 100% stock. But what it did is it flew by Eve, flew by Moho, flew by Eve again, flew by Kerbin again, and got itself all the way out to Duna. Yeah, it was a bit of an adventure. But I'm using it here just as kind of a generic payload that might be something typical. I mean, it is an interplanetary vessel. It might be something also would be typical in terms of masses of maybe a small lander that you might send towards Minmus or towards the moon. Its mass is 1.33 tons, so what we're looking at is building ourselves a shuttle that is capable of taking something like this into orbit. You can also see that it is constructed out of 1.25 meter parts, and the Mark II cargo bays can easily handle that size. If you start to go wider than that, then you're going to need to have like a Mark III shuttle bay, and that's going to be for a future episode. So let's retract here our antennas and make this something that we can maybe stick into our space shuttle. So in order to stick it into our space shuttle, what we're going to do is we're going to put this into the subassemblies. You can go over here. If we turn on the advanced modes here, we have subassemblies menu, and you can see I already have an Eve-001 here. So I've already done it, and I do have a video on talking about how to use subassemblies, but things have changed since then. You can now just grab the entire thing and throw it into the subassembly part zone. Before, you had to attach another part to it. Now, one thing when you drag things over to the subassemblies to create a subassembly is that every subassembly will have only one attachment point, and that attachment point will be whatever the free node is for the root part. So you can see, for instance, here, you can just see it. There's the attachment point on top of the probe body. Personally, I was fine with that as my attachment point, but if you don't like that, if you want to change it to something else, like say, for instance, I want to attach this by the engine, all you have to do is use the reroute tool, make the engine the root part, and now notice how the attachment node is now to the engine. So whatever you want to be the attachment point, just make that the root part and then just drag that into the subassembly zone and you'll create something like this. Alright, let's move into the space plane hangar and make our shuttle. So we'll start ourselves off with the Mark II cockpit, given that this is going to be a Mark II shuttle, and then we're going to get into the payload part here. We're going to grab some Mark II cargo bays. We're going to stick that on there. Now that's not going to be big enough for our payload, so we're going to put 2 of them on there. And then we want to make sure that the payload's going to work. I'm going to use, you can use either a docking port or a decoupler. for the attachment point. I'm going to use a decoupler because it's the simplest one. The advantage of using a docking port is that you can then use this thing to grab other things as long as they have docking ports. But I'm going to make it simpler and use just a decoupler. Now, one thing with the decoupler that you got to really pay attention to, if we zoom in here, is the little triangle. The base of the triangle is what it's going to remain attached to. So I want the decoupler to remain attached to the actual shuttle. So I actually have this the wrong way around. So I'm going to take it off again. We're going to flip it around. Flip it around the right way, that way, and put it on. So now the base of the triangle is attached to the shuttle, so the decoupler will stay with the shuttle, not attached to the probe. Okay, let's go into our Subassemblies menu, grab our EVOHO, and check to make sure that it is going to fit in there. Yep, it's going to fit in there absolutely fine. All right, and we can close the doors to make sure it's all good, right? No clipping. You can look inside here. Yep, it's perfectly good. Okay, now let's make this into something that will fly. So we're going to go back to our main menu here. We're going to go to fuel tanks, and we're going to grab the Mark II to 1.25 meter adapter. That's going to be our main source of fuel. We're going to stick that right here on the back. And powering this thing, we're going to have a Terrier engine. I'm going to stick that on the back here as well. This is a good point to sort of take a look at our staging, make sure this, yep, this is on vacuum. You can see that this has 1,202 meters per second of delta V and a thrust to weight ratio of 0.91. Obviously, we still got more to add on here, but it's good to sort of take a quick look at this. All this thing's going to do, remember, as far as this engine's job, its main job really, at a minimum, is going to be just to deorbit and land the thing again back at the KSC. It's going to be using boosters to get it up into orbit, so you don't need a lot of delta V. To get back down, you really need no more than about 100 meters per second of delta V left over after you've taken out the payload. So this is going to be a ton. So we're actually going to use part of this fuel to do the final part of our insertion as well. We'll keep that in mind. But let's, for now, close the cargo bays. And let's start actually making this thing look like a space plane by adding on some wings. So we're going to go to the aerodynamic surfaces. It is really tempting to do really, really big wings. Like if I arrange these by mass here, you can get into the great big, you know, these delta wings like that, and really have like, and there's also these wings. But a shuttle doesn't need really big wings. It just has to have the ability to get itself back down and be able to glide. It's not going to be a huge, you know, like a jet, a big flyer type of thing. It just needs to glide, and just once, really, right? So you don't need very, very big wings. And if you put on really big wings, that's just that much more for you to lift into orbit. It also will affect the aerodynamics of the rocket going up, where the wings are actually more of a detriment than they are an asset. So keep your wings as small as you can. So I'm going to use the smaller Type A wing, and then behind that I put a Type C wing just to make it a little bit longer, and to finish it all up we used a Type D wing just here on the end. And for the control surface I used the Elevon 2. You could use the Elevon 1, but let's face it, that tapered Elevon 2 just looks cooler. And of course we're going to use the move tool to kind of tweak this, make this look alright. And I also use the rotate tool to kind of turn these Type Ds at the end here up a little bit. It might help with the flying, but I'll be honest, I do that mostly because I think it looks better that way. We'll use a standard canard for our rudder. And now it's time to start thinking about the aerodynamics of this thing. Now remember, when this is flying on its own, it will have already deployed its payload. It'll be coming back empty. So consider that when you are flying it. So remember, when the center of the mass and center of lift, remember what it is for planes. You want the center of lift to be just behind the center of mass. Actually, usually the blue ball is kind of inside the yellow and black ball. But right now, this is not the state at which it's going to come back. So what we're going to do is we're going to take out our payload. We're also going to take out most of this fuel. It's going to be, I mean, right now it has 1,363 meters per second of delta V. It's going to use up a good chunk of that. There, we'll just do that just during its ascent. So this is more like the state at which it's going to come back. So I got to start thinking about, okay, I want this center of lift to be just a little bit behind the center of mass. Now, one thing that really helps during the ascent is to give yourself more control, is to use additional reaction wheels. So I'm actually going to go into the control section here. I'm going to grab a set of the advanced action wheels. That brings the mass back a little bit, but really not too much. So what we need to do is bring this center of lift all the way forward up to here. I'm not going to be able to accomplish that just by moving these surfaces. So what we're going to do is add in some more control surfaces. And back to aerodynamics, I'm going to once again grab the standard canard and we're going to stick these at the front. Yeah, about there's about right. Now, I could move these control surfaces forward and backwards. I mean, that's one thing I can do. If I click on here and start moving these forward, that does move this, you know, to some degree, and I could also move the other one as well. But you can see it doesn't move it a huge amount. Another thing you can do is not just move these forwards and back, but actually tilt them. So I'm going to keep this on fine control, not the snap control. We're going to grab this rotation tool and notice that if I tilt it, see how that affects where the center of lift is. You can actually control where the center, if you pitch upwards on this, it brings the center of lift forward, and if it pitches downwards, you can bring the center of lift backwards. And it can be pretty dramatic, the effect. There, that looks pretty good. And now let's see if we can fix the rest of this, not with rotation, but with the translation tools. When it comes to shuttles compared to planes, the center of mass probably should be a little bit more forward of the center of lift than you would normally do for something like a jet. Because as you're coming in, having that forward center of mass really will help you hold attitude as you descend through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. If the center of mass ever gets too far or too close to the center of lift, you're going to have a shuttle that you're going to have difficulty with controlling. But I'm thinking this is starting to look kind of all right. All right, let's turn this stuff all off. Go like that, go like that. And let's think about what else we want to do. We're going to need to start to dress this up a little. One thing, power generation. I should be thinking about that. Very simple solar panels. That's looking all right. And battery storage. There we go, like that. Now, I do want to make sure I can see here, for instance, this battery clipping out a little bit. So I'm just going to select that. Go to local. I'm going to tuck that in just a little bit, just so we're not clipping through the plane. Should also check to make sure that doesn't happen when I close the doors. Close the doors. Ah, it does. So again, we're just going to grab this one. We're just going to tuck her down a little bit. We have to make it. We don't want things actually clipping outwards. What else do we want to put on this thing? Oh, RCS, of course. We're not going to do any docking with this. We'll build a shuttle later that's capable of docking with something like perhaps a space station, so no docking ports are going to go on this thing, but it's nice to have a little bit of RCS just to help you deploy the payload. To translate the spacecraft ventrally, that would be downwards so that you can get this, leave the payload behind. So we're going to add in some RCS thrusters, and we don't need much. I'm going to use the really small thruster blocks, these ones that are only 5 kilograms each. I'm going to drop a couple of them about here. Let's put the lock on. And as far as the type goes, I actually only want to move up and down, right? So I'm just going to adjust this, whoops, so that there's only 2 ports, and now I can see actually I want it the other way. Perfect. That's great. Okay. And I'm going to put the center mass back on. We're going to put our payload back in. Here, payload. Beautiful. And we're going to put our other thruster blocks so that they're equally distributed on either side of the center of mass. So about here. And this doesn't have to be perfect. The reaction wheels in KSP are pretty powerful. Well, I honestly think that looks close enough. And I'll spend a bit of time dressing this up with some lighting, but then I got to think about the fact that this thing is supposed to land down on the runway. When it comes to landing, remember this thing will land once, hopefully, and will never take off from the runway. So typically what you would do with landing gear on planes is have the rear landing gear just a little bit behind the center of mass so that the plane can pitch up on those rear landing gear. That is not necessary. So when you go to put in your landing gear, and I'm just going to use, these small landing gear here. I don't think I need the big ones because this isn't that heavy of a plane. You can have them quite a ways behind the center of mass. Let's see. We'll do that there temporarily for now. We'll adjust those in just a little bit. And we are going to put one single one there. Should do for now. Okay. Now, when this thing comes down on the runway, when you have a plane that is taking off, it's nice to have it pitched up slightly. That helps with taking off. But for a shuttle, you actually have the opposite. It's never going to take off. It's going to land, and it will help you stick that landing on the runway if, when it's sitting on the runway, it is pitched down. That way, aerodynamic forces on the wings are actually pushing it down onto the runway. That's going to help you out. Now, this thing we can see right now is going to be pitched up rather severely. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab these landing gear. We're going to tuck them in as far as we sort of dare, and then we're going to take these landing gear. Let's see here, we're going to have to do a fair amount of tweaking, I think, with them. Let's see what that's going to be like if I bring that down onto top. So again, I can see that front landing gear landing first and the rear landing gear landing later. So this is going to be pitched up when it sits on the runway. So let's see, we'll tuck this up maybe a little bit further like that. What happens if I take these ones and extend them downward? So I want these more into the ground than the others. I think this is kind of alright. Maybe a little wider. I think it's looking okay. Let's retract them. Because obviously this is going to go up in a retracted position. Okay. We will open up our cargo base. Our payload back into here. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned as well, for this decoupler, right click on it, you want to take that force percentage and turn that right off to 0. You don't want the force of the decoupler to push that payload back into the back of the cargo bay. So you just want it to let it go. So make sure to do that. Take that decoupler and turn that coupling force right down to 0. We have one last thing here to do, and that is to tweak aerodynamic control surfaces. And this is just like a plane. You want the rudder to control yaw. So we're going to put that off of yaw control. We're going this to control roll. To be honest as well, you're going to need as much pitch authority as you can get as you descend through. Most of the time what you're going to be doing is pitching up, not so much rolling back and forth. So I'm also going to keep the pitch authority active as well on these. They are a fair amount behind the center of mass of the vehicle. Well, I do have the payload in it, but they are, even if I take this payload out. And so these will help with pitch authority, and then these guys at the back are solely for pitch authority. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take this thing, we're going to save it, and I want to test it. All I want to do is test the descent of this thing. And we're going to do that by saving it and then launching it onto the runway. And then we're going to bring up our cheat menu by pressing Alt and F12. And we're going to hit Cheats, and we're going to go to Set an Orbit, and we're going to set ourselves into a low orbit about Kerbin, just like that. I'm not going to attempt to put this down onto the runway. I have talked about landing on the runway before in reference to that low tech space plane from that earlier tutorial, and I will be talking about landing this one in detail in the next episode. But right now, all I'm interested in is how does this thing perform as it descends down through the atmosphere? Can I control it during its descent? Can I control the heating on it during its descent? That's the kind of thing I'm interested in. And then finally, at the end, am I capable of pitching up and gliding? And while we're watching this, I want to welcome aboard my 3 newest patrons, Philip Porch III, Bandit U, and Philip Kurtzman. Thank you very much, folks. Your support is very much appreciated, as the support of all of my patrons who inspire me continuously to keep making these videos on a regular basis. When designing a shuttle, you really are combining both aspects of rocket design and with atmosphere-only plane design. So why don't we sum this all up by emphasizing some of the unique features that designing a shuttle has. Number 1 is it doesn't need a lot of delta V. All it's got to do is deploy its payload and then get back down to the surface. And for the same reason, you also don't need a lot of thrust. So keep those 2 things down. That will minimize the mass of your vehicle, which will make it easier for you to get it up into orbit. And speaking of minimizing mass, also keep the wing size down. This thing is only going to fly once, and it's going to be flying down. It doesn't need very large wings like a regular airplane would. And keeping again the wing size down means less mass and an easier time getting it into orbit. We also spent some time taking a look at the center of lift and the center of mass and what should be their relative positions towards each other. And while we were doing that, we looked at how we can rotate the lifting surfaces to adjust the position of the center of lift. A very useful technique, not just for shuttles, but for any kind of a plane. And then finally, we finished off by taking a look at the landing gear positions, in particular the rear landing gear, which unlike planes, can be quite a ways behind the center of mass, which will help you stick that landing. And it turned out that this test actually went very, very well. It was very easy to control all the way down during its descent. I could pitch up and glide as I got down towards the surface. This thing is all ready to go, so join us next episode. We will design some boosters to put on this thing to get it into orbit. We will deploy a payload, and we'll talk in detail about how we can get back down and land safely on the runway. I hope to see you then.